On paper, this is a rich country, yet its people are forced to shuffle along in lines for toilet paper. At 65 years old, Ivan should be enjoying his retirement. Instead, he spends his days queuing.
What have you got in your shopping trolley? Nothing? What do you want today?
He wants sugar, milk, soap and toilet paper. This in a country with some of the largest oil reserves in the world. But the price of oil slumped, and the government's management of the economy has been disastrous.
I'm very annoyed. Only God knows what we're going through. Because in truth, no one is helping us. We have a government that doesn't care at all.
Desperation set in, which means not only has Ivan queued here for hours, he doesn't even know what for.
You've been here 3 hours?
3 horas. Y mira.
And do you know what you're going to get when you go into the shop?
No sabemos.
You don't know what you're waiting for?
Estamos aquí sin saber qué es lo que hay.
And it got worse. The front of the queue led to this. The loading bay of a supermarket, locked shut. There were no deliveries and no goods.
So the line stops here and then what?
It's a symbol of a system that's failing.
Scenes like this are playing out across the country as people swap rumours about what goods are available where, spending hours every day standing in line. So people have become almost obsessed by the shortages. And it's played extremely badly for the government here, which has now turned to its old nemesis, the United States, accusing it of waging an economic war against the people. And a recent move by Washington, declaring Venezuela a national security threat, has just handed the government here a propaganda victory.
President Maduro accused America of trying to overthrow his government. Military exercises were ordered. Diplomats were expelled as he rallied people to his side.
Obama liked to destroy Venezuela. And if journalists from England are very good with Venezuela, they need to understand very well that at the moment, Venezuela is near to be attacked from the United States.
President Obama said it was part of sanctions against 7 officials, that he doesn't really see Venezuela as a threat. But it's hampered his efforts to redraw America's image. And although it's given President Maduro a reprieve, it'll be short-lived, as Venezuela's problems only grow. There are fears the economic crisis is literally killing people. Dr. Romero is a cancer surgeon. He gets just $50 a month in a public hospital, so also works here in a private clinic. He says patients in the state system are at greater risk, more having radical surgery, because of a shortage of equipment and medicine.
The situation right now is very difficult. Every day is worse. And if the things going on like this, will be a humanitarian crisis.
A humanitarian crisis? You think it's that?
I think there will be every day the rate mortality is growing up. And breast cancer is going up.
Many here live in fear of opposing the government. But there have been protests, some violent. And unless the price of oil rallies, there's likely to be more shortages and even greater strife. Ian Pannell, BBC News, Caracas.
It doesn't take you long in oil-rich Venezuela to find this. Roadblocks by people saying they're struggling to get food.
As soon as we got off the car, people had just started shouting and telling us that they're hungry, really.
These are desperate people inside a country where recent shortages and hyperinflation are hitting hard. This woman says that she sometimes goes to sleep crying because she hasn't been able to give her children any food.
This is what they're saying they eat, mangoes, that they get from the tree, that's all.
Unsustainable public spending in the last decade has combined with a severe drop in the oil prices, leaving this crude exporting nation almost on its knees. Today, Venezuela has severe food shortages, and the inflation is expected to close this year at over 700%, leaving many unable to eat 3 times a day. This is plain rice.
¿Esta es la comida más fuerte del día?
Esa es la que yo me como. Esa es la única que se acuesta con esto. Ahora y se acuesta con eso.
Esto es lo único que van a comer hoy.
Eso es lo único que yo como.
This town is in deep rural Venezuela. It's in the Zulia province where, ironically, oil was first discovered here.
¿Cómo se siente con esta situación?
No. No te voy a decir porque no hay nombre. Estamos viviendo lo que estamos viviendo todos, los venezolanos. Todos los venezolanos. ¿Ah?
¿Cuándo fue la última vez que comió?
Ayer.
¿A qué hora?
A las 3 de la tarde.
¿Y desde entonces nada?
Nada.
Agua.
Agua, 4 vasos de agua que me he bebido.
These are images that have been rarely seen outside of Venezuela.
Jamás en mis 8 años como pediatra y en mi edad de vida que tengo nunca había visto una situación actual como la que estamos atravesando ahorita. Estamos enfrentando una situación de desnutrición materno-infantil.
How have things become this bad in a country blessed with natural resources? This is a common sight in Caracas, the capital, queues for food. These people are desperate to buy goods sold at a government-regulated price, but they can only buy a limited amount once a week. With inflation so high, some have even left their jobs to make an income queuing for regulated price food and reselling it for at least 100 times its value in a thriving black market. This country may be in crisis, but the government of President Nicolás Maduro says it's fighting speculation with brute force. But it blames also foreign powers and businessmen for a so-called economic war that seeks to topple his regime. Venezuela elected this man 17 years ago, Hugo Chavez, hoping that poverty would be eradicated. His socialist experiment was always criticized for supposedly being unsustainable. 3 years after Chavez died, this is the sight which he probably never thought he'd see. Queues for food in the middle of the night, under the rain. Vladimir Hernandez, BBC News, Caracas. This is Zulia's biggest and popular meat market. Well, it used to be at least. Now it's less about meat and more about hooves, fat, tripe and bones. Animal offcuts have become the affordable option for Venezuelans, priced out by hyperinflation. Anything makes a good soup or stew.
Y jefe, lo veo comprando pellejo. Y todo. Es lo que le alcanza. Antes podía comprar otra. Rotten beef is also sold here in this market. It smells strong. It's got flies all over it. Y la gente come eso, lo compra.
Se lo compro porque imagínate que van a hacer lo más barato.
Pienso que como está la situación, la gente compra lo que sea ahorita para el consumo. Porque no tiene con qué pagar 1 kilo de carne, no puede comprar 1 kilo de pollo, la gente no tiene cómo comprar 1 kilo de pollo porque el dinero no le abastece.
A kilo of beef costs up to 1/3 of the monthly minimum wage and would provide maybe a couple of meals, but this rotten beef is 1% of a salary. Refrigerators in the market have constant power cuts.
Y si falla la luz 10 veces en el día, aparte de eso se va por 4 horas seguidas. Al otro día cuando tú vas a sacar la mercancía estás en malas condiciones.
It's not just electricity. There's chaos everywhere. Hospitals are also affected by this crisis. Equipments and beds left derelict. There's no money to repair them. No garbage removal means outside hospitals you find huge piles of medical waste, including drips and needles. And piles of rubbish are also a source for food here. For desperate families, anything will do. But this is a province with huge oil reserves. This wealth is almost everywhere. It's under the ground, it's right up to its shores.
Many here accuse the government of mismanaging the country's enormous wealth, to which the ruling party is very quickly to reply that it's foreign government and the political opposition who are to blame. But you have to queue for almost everything, from food to cash withdrawals, queues in which you can easily spend the whole day. Public transport is on the verge of collapse. People now take whatever form of transport they can find. And frequent power shortages are often leading to protests. This is a community that's been 5 days without any electricity. In this part of the country, this is not rare. This is happening all the time. Not even those who die escape the crisis. Frequent power cuts mean morgues can't keep bodies refrigerated.
A ver que se me están quedando semanas, se me están quedando 2 o 3 semanas, que se me están pudriendo, que se me llegan a explotar. Ayer metí por cierto una bolsa llena de gusanos, sin guantes, sin mascarilla, una falta de respeto. Estoy meses ahorita con esos cadáveres ahí. Si les digo a la funeraria, ¿qué pasó? Si el gobierno no me paga, yo no me puedo llevar los cadáveres. Y tiene toda la razón.
This is a rich nation, but most people here are not rich.
¿Y cómo le afecta la falta de luz acá?
When I met Maria Eugenia, she had been 5 days without any electricity. Her only fridge was connected to a neighbour's generator.
So we've got 2 fridges. This one works, not much in it. This one got damaged in a power cut.
Está dañada. En un apagón que hubo. Se me quemó un aire, después fue la nevera y después fue la bomba.
Maria is about to undergo surgery for breast cancer, and she's had to find and buy everything the doctors need, including needles, drugs, and even the gloves. Hospitals simply don't have them. But she's worried about how she will recover in a house with no air conditioning in 40 degrees heat.
Yo no tengo dónde ir.
Maria's drama is a Venezuelan drama. Vladimir Hernandez, BBC News, Maracaibo.
Días sin agua, fines de semana sin agua, días en la semana sin agua, sin aviso, sin previo aviso. No porque se reventó una bomba, no porque hay un arreglo de tubería, no, o sea, no hay agua, no hay agua. Realmente uno al día a día no te das cuenta de lo que has ido perdiendo, no te das cuenta. Ha sido tan paso a paso que uno va como tapando y no te das cuenta. O sea, cuando te paras afuera y dices, ya va, perdí esto, y te das cuenta, ahí es que, Dios mío, he dejado de hacer miles y miles de cosas, he ido en caída y no me he dado cuenta. Pero yo sí creo que uno tiene que hacer las cosas bien. Yo sí creo que hay una esperanza. Yo sí creo que la gente está obstinada. Yo sí creo que si estamos juntos y nos apoyamos todos, es como lo del agua ahorita, que la vecina tenía el carro, nosotros hicimos la cola y la otra no podía y nosotros cargamos. Y yo sé que mañana o otro día, si nosotros no podemos, ella nos va a conseguir agua. Yo estoy segura de eso. Entonces, yo pienso que que la gente tiene que terminar de entender eso, es que sí podemos hacer las cosas. Tengo un filtro.
11-year-old Mariana is tired. She's been out on the streets since early in the morning, begging. Today was 40 degrees and it was hard work, but her bubbly personality still showed through.
Estoy teniendo mucha hambre. No sentía en el cuerpo la hambre.
Marisela, her mother, looks exhausted.
Llegamos hacia las casas. A veces que no encuentro nada, a veces me ha tocado sacarle la basura. Para llevar algo así.
Que si tiene algo por ahí para que me regale. Que tengo hambre.
¿Qué te dice la mamá?
No hay nada y después me da un pan.
Y eso es hace 3 años para acá porque yo tenía a mi marido trabajaba, pero mi marido es muerto.
gente te mira feo, te critica por estar pidiendo en la calle?
Le da rabia, le da pena. Porque él habla mierda de los otros.
Porque no saben la necesidad que uno está pasando y yo tengo a mis hijas y no gusta que mis hijos pasen hambre.
This is a frequent sight in most towns and cities. Children and adults desperately rummaging through rubbish to find something to eat. Food is a luxury for many Venezuelans, especially for those here in the slums. There are regular shortages of basic goods, and what's available is too expensive. Children are the most vulnerable.
Desde el 2016 notamos una mayor afluencia de chicos en situación de calle al patio abierto y por supuesto aumentó en un 40-50% la población de chicos que acudían a nosotros. A finales del primer semestre del 2018 registramos un aumento del 60% de los niños en situación de calle. Por supuesto nos alertó más que el aumento de la cantidad, nos alertó un mayor número de niñas en situación de calle.
I spent some time with a group of street kids here in Caracas.
With no home, no food, no one to give them any clothes even. It's in supermarkets where they come to ask people for anything they can help with.
En la calle te pasan muchas cosas, te ven los policías, te pegan, te tratan mal, la gente te menosprecia porque estás en la calle. Hay personas que nos insultan, nos dicen, vayan a pedirle al presidente.
En mi casa había más o menos comida, no alcanzaba, nosotros éramos muchos.
Bien, nada más mi hermana, mis dos hermanas, yo y mis otros dos hermanos, y mamá. Y más nada.
¿Y papá?
No, mi papá está muerto.
Está muerto.
Y nosotros también somos seres humanos, pues. Entonces, a mí no me gustaría estar el resto de mi vida en la calle, pues.
En los 2 últimos años igualmente hemos visto el agravamiento, bien sea de casos de maltrato de niños, pues a los que se les ha golpeado severamente, niños que con cucharillas calientes se les ha pues casi que malogrado las manitos en la boca por haber tomado un alimento que estaba reservado para la noche o por haber comido un pedazo de pan o una arepa que era para el hermanito. El alimento como motivo de enfrentamiento, en las escuelas también, ¿no?
Yo me vine de mi casa porque de verdad mi mamá me trataba mal y broma. Me cansé, pues, porque es verdad, yo prefiero que coman mis hermanos que come yo.
Yo sé que algún día voy a estudiar, voy a salir, y cuando yo sea grande, pues lo mejor la gente que me pida yo le voy a regalar, porque pasé por la misma necesidad.
NGOs say that the crisis is also making expecting mothers make drastic decisions as they've sunk further into poverty. Maria, not her real name, is 6 months pregnant. She's already decided to give the baby an adoption. I met her and her other 5 children a couple of years ago. Since then, she's given 3 of them to other families who could look after them. Before the current crisis hit in full force, people here were able to cope with numerous children. Now it's almost impossible, as everything is in short supply, including forms of contraception.
No, porque yo hablé, ya ellos están grandecitos, y yo hablé con ellos, le dije, no es que yo los quiera dar ni nada, sino que ahorita en verdad no tengo las maneras para tenerlo. Pero pídanle a Dios que si yo las tengo, yo me los llevo a todos.
But there are other cases like this. I also met Judith, who weeks ago gave her own child away after a C-section.
Yo solamente pensaba bueno, mientras tanto voy a tener algo que darle a los niños de comer y que la niña iba a estar bien. Me siente pues no tenerla conmigo.
It's night time again in Caracas. We meet up again with the same group, and immediately we meet their leader.
A la vez dormimos y a la vez no, porque uno vive como unas 2 horas. Viene el carro y se para y uno piensa que se lo va a meter así.
They offer to show me where they'll spend the night.
These are the children of families who could just simply not afford to have another mouth to feed. In these terrible economic times, very difficult times, having another mouth to feed, it's become impossible. Now, it's here on those streets where they need to get by.
We reach the bush where they were hoping to spend the night. The cardboard they were using as blanket have been thrown away. A chilly night awaits, and a very uncertain future. Vladimir Hernandez, BBC News, Caracas.
It's not easy to get inside Venezuela's ailing health system. The government tries hard to keep the cameras out. But doctors brought us into one of the main public hospitals in Caracas, determined that we should see the truth.
Y también están dañados, vean los equipos de tomar.
And this is the reality behind the dream of free treatment for all. An empty promise, staff say, because of government neglect. You get a real insight here into the state of Venezuela's health service. This should be refrigerated and it should be full of insulin. It broke down 5 years ago and it's never been fixed. And just here at my feet, there's a dead cockroach. The health service in this country is in a state of collapse. Nearby, we found medical waste, including used needles, strewn around. This is one of the showers. Sometimes there's no running water, so relatives have to bring in bottles. Maria shows us where her nephew Luis cooks his food, in the bathroom. Luis is gravely ill with a brain tumour. His family have been keeping him alive by spending all their savings, but he needs more help. I still have to rent the surgical equipment they need for my operation, he says, and buy all the supplies, even the gauze. Every day that passes, he loses a little more of his sight. The hospital can't give the sick much more than a bed. Under President Nicolas Maduro, this is the picture of health. We'll take a look at just how bad things are here. There's mold growing all the way down the wall. We're in the internal medicine department. This is the isolation area. This patient here has lymphoma. The patient here has TB, and we've been told he's receiving absolutely no treatment. So David, who is 20, can only rest and hope. His mother is grateful he's been admitted. Another hospital turned him away because of lack of funds. I'm feeling a little better now, he tells me. I feel relieved. But then he admits he does have some pain. In the bed next door, 21-year-old Carlos, a cancer patient and much-loved only son. His mother, Diana, has just been told he needs a biopsy that she must pay for. It would take her nearly 2 years to earn the money, if she had a job. For dedicated doctors here, like Carlos Prosperi, anguish, frustration and anger at the government. I blame President Maduro, he says. We doctors have to tell the truth. We have to do our best to save our patients. But nowadays we can't. We feel blocked because of the government. Doctor, you've been speaking very bravely, very openly. Isn't there a risk that something could happen to you now because of what you've been telling us? Anyone can be afraid, he says. Of course I am worried, but I prefer to live in a free country rather than live in oppression and let my patients have nothing. Just outside the door, slabs of raw meat on sale. A discarded scanning machine now serves as somewhere for staff to sit. Doctors in Venezuela say sometimes all they can do is help their patients die, not help them live. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Caracas.
Gunshots on the border between Colombia and Venezuela. They've become frequent in these past few weeks.
Que llegaron golpeando las puertas, dañando las ventanas, agarrando gente.
No, que se nos está metiendo a la casa, que no, que los están golpeando.
The result? This. Thousands of Venezuelans are crossing this river into Colombia, fleeing from the crossfire. Jairo is one of them.
Por allí, en aquel frente de allí, aquí abajito, fue donde quemaron las casas, las motos que le estaba mostrando ahorita.
¿Qué se siente estar tan cerca de su casa y sin embargo no poder estar en ella?
No, se siente, o sea, una tristeza. Lo que le invade a uno es una tristeza, me dan ganas de llorar, de verdad, que de ver que de tantos años de estar allí, construir lo que construimos ahí, el trabajo de tantos años, que no es fácil, y prácticamente uno lo siente perdido.
They are fleeing fighting between the army of Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro and groups he calls terrorists and imperialists. For years, there's been allegations that the Venezuelan government tolerates Colombian guerrillas in the country, but recently something changed, and now they're fighting each other. This month, almost 6,000 Venezuelans have fled their country. These refugee camps were quickly set up a few weeks ago. Social distancing here is impossible.
The humanitarian response here has been huge, but most of the refugees are in informal shelters hosted by Colombians, by locals, like this one.
This woman fled with her young children.
A mis hijos los tengo engañados. Según yo les digo a ellos que estamos de vacaciones. Cada vez que sonaba una bomba o algo, le decían, uy, va a llover.
4 different families are staying in this small house, crammed on top of each other. They're still in shock about how they were pushed out of their homes by the Venezuelan military.
Llegaron tropas del ejército, llegaron convoy, llegaron tanques, llegaron esto. A esa hora de la noche tocó todo el mundo empezar a salir a correr.
Jairo published a few videos on social media of how the military burned his house.
Una de las casas que quemó el ejército venezolano. A uno le corre sangre por las venas. A mí me dio mucha rabia de ver que le hayan hecho esto a esta gente inocente.
Government supporters have accused him of being part of the Colombian guerrilla Venezuela is fighting.
Y por ese video que yo hice, el gobierno lo toma como en contra. Esa es una de las maneras que ellos usan. Digo algo contrario a lo de ellos, ya por eso yo soy terrorista.
That's why Jairo doesn't want to go back to Venezuela.
Just like Jairo is helping his relatives building a new house, we've seen several families in the same situation. They're really close from their actual land, and yet they have to build a new life in this side of the border.
These 3 women, who asked not to be named because they fear for their safety, even in Colombia, decided to stay on this side.
No sabemos si estamos refugiados, si somos desplazados, en qué quedamos nosotros, porque estamos sin respuesta de nada. Entonces me preocupa mucho porque yo quiero migrar para otro país por temer a mi vida y la de mis hijos.
These refugees are adding to the pressure Colombia is already under. The country has received almost 2 million migrants from Venezuela due to the country's economic collapse. So the people who just got here because of the fighting fear that Colombia doesn't have the means to help them. The Caracas government has shown images of Venezuelans returning home over the past month. But there are still thousands of people too scared to cross the river that separates them from their home because of the ongoing conflict. Which is why Jairo and many others are hoping to build a new future here.
It is precisely because citizens and civil society can be so powerful that more and more governments are doing everything in their power to silence them.
Nicolas Maduro is a dictator with no legitimate claim to power. He's never won the presidency in a free and fair election, and he's maintained his grip of power by imprisoning anyone who dares to oppose him.
From Venezuela, you are seeing relentless crackdowns vilifying legitimate dissent as subversive. We stand in solidarity with those who are detained at this very moment.
Venezuela is experiencing the worst economic crisis of its history. Political and social chaos engulf what was once one of Latin America's most prosperous societies. An estimated 3 million migrants have fled the country, nearly 10% of Venezuela's population. Of those who remain, nearly 90% live in poverty. Despite severe shortages of medicine and food, Maduro has often denied that a humanitarian crisis even exists.
Toda la campaña que se ha hecho de migración en Venezuela se ha exagerado. Venezuela es un país receptor de migrantes. Yo les digo que ustedes han montado un estereotipo en la BBC de Londres, en los medios estadounidenses también, de una Venezuela que no existe.
Hundreds of thousands are now protesting against Maduro's government, and the military's response has caused hundreds of deaths. The United States and European Union imposed sanctions on Venezuelan officials, including freezing their assets and canceling visas. The US recently imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil, blocking $18 billion in oil transactions. Maduro doesn't appear to be backing down. Just a few years ago, Venezuela was once hailed by many as the poster child for successful democratic socialism.
The president of Venezuela is leading the struggle to build that socialism here in our 21st century.
But now the government is widely criticized as a totalitarian regime and dictatorship, and President Maduro's legitimacy as president is under fire. Maduro was appointed president after Hugo Chavez died in 2013, but when Maduro was re-elected in 2018, his election was considered a fraud because it failed to meet international standards of freedom and fairness. This began in 2015, 2 years before his re-election, when the opposition won a supermajority in the Venezuelan Congress. Maduro responded by creating a separate legislature. Loyalists won all 545 seats in the new assembly and gave itself the power to rewrite the nation's constitution and fire dissident state officials, stripping the original legislature of its powers. This sparked massive protests in the country who viewed the new assembly as blatantly unconstitutional. Maduro made it easier to silence critics by exiling and arresting opposition party members. These actions caused Maduro's popularity to wane during the economic crisis, and his approval rating decreased to 20%. However, with the most popular opposition leaders barred from elections, it didn't matter. 8 months after his re-election, Maduro's presidency was challenged. The president of the opposition majority National Assembly, Juan Guaido, declared on January 23rd that he was the new president interim. When Guaido first began pushing the Venezuelan military to recognize him, and not Maduro as a legitimate leader, he was arrested by the government police. It wasn't long after his release that Guaido said he would assume the presidency on an interim basis in order to call free elections. His interim presidency received widespread international support, including most of the European Union, the United States, and the majority of Venezuela's neighbors in South America.
Trascendente misión de poder avanzar hacia la recuperación de la democracia, del Estado de Derecho, de las libertades en un país hermano como Venezuela.
But you also need the army to be involved. That's what Juan Guaido has been asking for all day, for the army to back him, and so far, we're not sure if that's going to happen.
Conozco al diputado Juan Guaidó como presidente encargado de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela. A mis compañeros de armas, les pido que no le den la espalda al pueblo de Venezuela. No repriman más.
Despite criticisms of an illegitimate election victory, many countries still support Maduro as the current president. Furthermore, the defense minister stated that Venezuela's armed forces do not recognize Juan Guaido as president. Despite resistance from the military, Guaido pushed for democratic elections and international aid. Maduro responded by creating blockades at the border to prevent humanitarian aid from coming through. In the middle of these tensions, the clashes between protesters and the military could get increasingly violent. But how did Venezuela go from riches to rags in a few years? And how did the nation end up accused of being a dictatorship? Answering these questions involves understanding political shifts towards totalitarian leadership since Hugo Chavez began his presidency in 1999.
The following.
Political moves by the Venezuelan government over the last 2 decades comprised a complicated mix of socialist reform for the poor as well as increased nationalization of domestic businesses. Venezuela is one of 14 nations of OPEC and at one point produced over 10% of the world's crude oil, but many in the country felt they never saw the benefits of the booming oil economy. Chavez built his image around these frustrations. One of Chavez's main goals was to use PDVSA, the largest state oil company, to establish socialist programs that would use the money from the oil company to help the poor. At first, the program showed promise due to record-high oil prices in Venezuela. Around 98% of export profits were from oil revenues, so decreasing poverty levels were largely dependent on the rise of global oil prices. But not everyone was satisfied with Chavez's attempts to further nationalize businesses in the country. Oil executives and workers at PDVSA challenged Chavez's motives to politicize the company, and they decided to strike. In 2003, Chavez fired 19,000 employees, close to half of the workforce from PDVSA, and blacklisted them from future employment in the oil sector. These workers were replaced with employees loyal to his government, and later the government threatened to remove all workers who did not support Chavez. The massive loss in skilled workers triggered a deeper decline in oil production. This incident became one of many that showed that workers were no longer protected by the Constitution against acts of political discrimination. Chavez also prepared Venezuela poorly for its economic future by spending so much of the oil production on welfare programs while failing to reinvest into the same oil companies. The nationalization of businesses began to cripple domestic production. When Chavez came to power, there were more than 800,000 private businesses. Today, fewer than 233,000 remain. In 2004, the Chavez government abandoned their commitment to judicial independence. The assembly then launched a political takeover of the Supreme Court. They enacted a new law expanding the court from 20 to 32 members. This made it possible for Chavez and his supporters in the assembly to pack and purge the Supreme Court. The political takeover of the Supreme Court effectively neutralized the judiciary as an independent branch of government. Chavez cracked down on civil rights, setting precedents that would gradually restrict free speech in Venezuela. He passed a series of laws that included restrictions on freedom of speech, including control of the internet, a virtual ban on the foreign funding of NGOs, and dismissal of legislative officials wishing to switch sides. Chavez also silenced media critics by refusing to renew broadcast licenses of major TV stations in Venezuela.
No se va a tolerar aquí ningún medio de comunicación que esté al servicio del golpismo contra la independencia nacional. Venezuela se respeta.
Chavez's spending put the nation deep in debt, and the national reserves began to decline. Venezuela was on the edge of a resource curse. Failing to diversify in new industries and reinvest in oil could collapse the new social welfare programs. And that's exactly what happened. But the social welfare programs wouldn't collapse until after Chavez's death in 2013, when Nicolas Maduro became president. In 2014, oil prices fell globally and government spending became unsustainable. The country's imports decreased dramatically, and the government slashed budgets for maintaining the nation's oil fields. Venezuela's oil production hit a 3-decade low of 1.5 million barrels a day. Maduro could no longer pay for imports, so he started printing money. This triggered massive levels of hyperinflation throughout the country. Maduro also restricted access to foreign currencies. Most Venezuelans were trading bolivars in the black market for US dollars at extremely high rates because they were excluded from official exchange rates that often only military elite and government officials had access to. Many of Maduro's solutions to the economic crisis failed to resolve root issues. The lack of imports combined with a failing local economy resulted in scarcity at grocery stores, often leaving shelves completely empty. The healthcare system was in shambles. At one point, 70% of blood banks didn't have any access to usable blood. Despite this, Maduro refused opportunities from the international community to provide humanitarian aid. His efforts to restore trust in the Venezuelan currency failed. He circulated a new currency after inflation rates skyrocketed, lopping 5 zeros off the bolivar and renaming it the sovereign bolivar. This didn't resolve the problem of inflation, it was a cosmetic fix. The crisis was so bad that Venezuela's homicide and murder rates rose to among the highest in the world. Maduro continued to suppress free speech. Venezuela saw over 70 newspapers, TV, and radio stations close, while attacks and arrests of journalists increased.
I conducted an interview with Nicolás Maduro. I showed him a video that I personally took of 3 kids behind a trash truck looking for food. He didn't want to continue the interview. He tried to close my iPad where I showed him the video, and they confiscated all our cameras, 4 cameras. After 2 hours of being detained, they allow us to leave the presidential palace. I think we'll never have that interview again. They don't want the world to see what we did.
Venezuela is now desperate to strengthen and diversify its domestic industries. But how can this happen with price controls, high inflation rates, the migration epidemic, and the government's takeover of private businesses? Under the leadership of Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, the accumulation of power in the executive branch and erosion of human rights have enabled the government to intimidate, censor, and punish its critics. Shortages of medical supplies and food have intensified, and weak government responses have undermined Venezuelans' access to food and health care. A call to free elections may be Venezuela's best chance at revitalizing basic human rights, which have declined in the last 20 years. What's clear is there's no immediate fix for such a deep political and economic crisis. Perhaps progress towards long-term solutions would come if Maduro steps down and democracy is restored.